Drugs. Ask yourself what comes to mind when I say that. Does a certain drug come to mind? Does a particular experience come to mind? Or is it just a general topic that you know something about, but nothing specific comes to mind? Honestly, I don't know what pops into my head when I say that, but I usually land on the topic of the long, complicated history of how drugs are viewed in this country. The war on drugs generally refers to the long, drawn-out educational and legal efforts perpetuated mainly by Nixon and Reagan with the goal of decreasing drug usage in this country. At least that's what they told the public. Looking back, it's pretty clear that Nixon was just racist and hungry for war and did anything to demonize the parts of the population who liked weed. And Reagan's motivations were not too different. It's important to keep in mind that when I talk about this topic, everything I say is based in facts, but my opinions on the topic may influence some of the ways that I talk about it. Here's a quick quote to summarize what the government was aiming for with their efforts.
We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Believe it or not, that was said by the Assistant to the President for Domestic Affairs under Nixon. Their tactics and strategies were drawn out for decades, and after doing a decent amount of research on the topic, my one question is, how is this still influencing the way people think today? It's obvious to me that older generations and even members of Generation X could have been heavily influenced by some of the brainwashing tactics. But how does it influence people who are old enough to form their own opinion, but young enough to grow up in a time when we started acknowledging how harmful some of this history is? Let's talk about how the government views these drugs today. The Drug Enforcement Agency has something called the drug scheduling system. This is meant to categorize different substances to determine how legal they should be and how people should use them. Cannabis still sits at Schedule 1, defined as high potential for abuse and no medical benefits, while substances such as cocaine and methamphetamine sit at Schedule 2. Now personally, I don't actually think anyone at the government thinks cocaine is better for you than weed. So why does this scheduling persist? The most common explanation is that the government simply does not want it to be easy for research to be done on these substances. Is it because they don't want scientists to find out the facts, to expose the fact that the government has been lying to us about these substances for years? Or maybe it's the fact that if some of these substances were available for medicinal use, the whole pharmaceutical industry would tank. I honestly don't know the true reason, and I don't think anyone has the correct answer. This is still something that we're struggling with as a country. But next time you hear about someone's home getting raided for a few grams of weed while half your friends have prescription amphetamines and opioids, ask yourself, who are these laws truly benefiting? For this part, I wanted to go around and ask some of the young people in my community what they know and think about the war on drugs. I don't think I could do an assessment of what this demographic thinks about the topic without going out and actually asking them. How do you define drugs, or a drug?
I kind of see a drug as any sort of stimulant that changes, like, your perception, whether it be slightly or, like, to an extreme. And obviously, like, there's classifications of drugs.
A drug is something that can alter your mood and the ways that you act and the way that you think. Just go about just changes how you go about your day.
Drug is anything that alters your state of being, I think.
What do you know about the war on drugs?
Well, I know that the war on drugs is an effort by the government to try and keep drugs off the streets and out of the people's hands. But they did this in a very racist way. Shout out Nixon and shout out Reagan and Bush, all doing beautiful work on that. But yeah, it's just trying to put people in prison for doing drugs.
Now, when do you think a person should go to prison for a drug-related crime?
I mean, if you're like Pablo Escobar and it's kind of just what you're doing with the drugs that's violent, then yeah, probably go to prison.
Depending on the drug and the amount at which it's being used or sold, I think all should be taken into account, but I don't think anyone should ever go to jail for weed.
I think that it should be someone like Pablo Escobar, but there isn't many people like Pablo Escobar, and those are the bad people that kill and whatever. I watched the show Narcos, but other than that, minor offenses like having weed on you, I don't think that should be an offense that you should go to prison for.
I think if it turns violent, I think that's definitely a way. I understand that like drug dealers are partially put in because it has to do with drugs, but it's also unregulated activity that like affects the economy. So I understand, but I still think that should be a fine. Mostly just violent crimes.
I don't think people should go to prison for drug-related charges. I don't think it actually does anything to solve the problem. Maybe that person isn't actively using drugs while they are in prison, but if no rehabilitation is happening, then they're just going to go out and abuse it again once they leave.
So do you think it is immoral to do drugs?
Absolutely not.
I'd say it kind of can depend. I feel like if you are doing something that is off the street, like heroin, that makes you more likely to, I guess, commit a crime, maybe. But other than that, if it's like marijuana or alcohol, I think that's pretty mainstream and normal. I don't think there should be a lot of judgment on that.
In your community and amongst your friends, what drug do you see most commonly used?
Alcohol.
Weed and coke, probably.
Really? Not alcohol?
Oh, and alcohol, I guess. I don't consider that a drug.
Alcohol and tobacco.
Marijuana. Or nicotine, or alcohol.
What would you say is more harmful, alcohol or cannabis?
I'd say alcohol because it's a poison.
So why do you think cannabis is illegal in so many states, but alcohol is illegal all over the country?
I mean, there's a lot of factors to it, but like, I think people just make too much money off of it being illegal and just racist.
What do you know about the war on drugs?
It was created to put the black community at a disadvantage, and they brought drugs into society, sold them for cheaper to black drug dealers.
Why do you think cannabis is illegal in so many states when prescription drugs and alcohol are not?
To be honest with you, I'm not really sure. I don't really understand any part of that. I don't think it should be illegal, and I think that there are a lot of therapeutic effects. I had a friend with cancer that used it for medicinal purposes.
Because it's seen as a drug used by minorities mostly, so they know that they can use that. Like if you look at most like percentages for like marijuana arrests in America, they're like 4-1 or like 8-1 black to white, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, and there's been like stats showing that white people and black people use weed at very similar rates, but black people go to jail for it so much more. And 50% of like people in federal prisons are there for drug charges, which is insane.
I feel like when you like society sees a black guy like smelling like weed or smoking weed, it's more of like an image of like, oh, he's a thug, drug dealer, all that. But like if a white dude is selling drugs or like smells like weed, it's more like, oh, he's just like a hippie. He's just having fun, enjoying life.
What do you think is more harmful, cannabis or alcohol?
Probably alcohol, because you can't drive you're not supposed to drive on either, but you really can't drive a car when you are drinking, and it can make you say and do things that you don't mean.
What do you know about the war on drugs?
I know that it was started by Nixon and continued by Reagan, and they basically tied drugs to minority groups, specifically Hispanic Americans and African Americans, in order to either get them deported or put them in jail to exploit free work.
Cool. Do you think it's immoral to do drugs?
I don't think it's immoral. I think it can turn immoral if it like harms your relationships with other people or like affects, how you like go to work and that kind of thing.
I think it's more how it's used. Immoral isn't necessarily the right word. I think it varies from person to person.
Do you think drugs are harmful to society?
I think some drugs are harmful to society. I think that the fact that things like tobacco and alcohol are so like entwined with our culture is a bad thing. And I think that like, you know, how there's violent crimes being committed with drugs, such as like the cartel. I mean, that's not really, you know, our society, but it affects our society.
And what would you say is more harmful, alcohol or cannabis?
I'd say alcohol is more harmful, both to your body, and decisions that people make off of alcohol are more reckless.
So why do you think cannabis is still legal in so many places in this country?
I think partially it's because of the culture of tying it to minority groups, and also because it affects the timber industry, because hemp is a cheaper, more renewable way to have lumber and whatnot, and then would put the timber industry out of business.
What do you know about the war on drugs?
I said easy questions,
Would you say drugs are harmful to society?
They can be, depending how they're used. Obviously, they can be addictive. They can break families apart. Certain drugs can make people violent or mean, irrational, etc.
Do you think good things can come from drugs?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when used in the right settings and quantities and when research is done, they can be used in healthy ways to benefit the mind and body.
And what do you think is more harmful, alcohol or cannabis?
Definitely alcohol. Not good for your body, not good for your decision-making abilities.
So why do you think cannabis is still illegal in a lot of parts of the country?
I think it's for a lot of reasons. I think a political agenda has been pushed with the anti-drug movement. Obviously, we know it ties back to racism. I think it's to make it easier to put certain groups of people in jail for unjustified reasons.
If you're feeling at all frustrated or angered after learning this, you're not alone. Ever since these efforts began in the 60s, there have been people who dedicated their lives to opposing unjust laws such as these. The 1960s were a time of change. With people like Nixon in power pushing racist agendas and supporting the war in Vietnam, many members of the public noticed a problem and started questioning traditional ways of thinking because they realized that maybe those in power never had our best interest in mind to begin with. It is described as an era of change in identity, family unit, sexuality, dress, and the arts. It was a time when the youth rejected social norms and exhibited their disapproval of racial, ethnic, and political injustices. This counterculture was disapproved by many, but that only showed these hippies that they were doing the right thing. It was meant to challenge many people's traditional views. Now I pose a question to leave you with. Where do you still see the influences of the war on drugs and the counterculture today? Do you see any of your ways of thinking that could have been influenced by either? Remember, never be afraid to question your perceptions and challenge your own views. True change starts with the individual. Thank you for watching, and peace out.